Hi, everyone, and welcome to our next case, Mugler versus Kansas. Okay, so let's start off with the way we've started off every single case this semester. If you want to be able to do well on the exams, you're going to need to know who did what to whom to bring about the case, be able to state what the issue is, be able to figure out how the issue gets resolved. And I should have rewritten this because there's only one opinion here. It's not just that there's a majority and dissent. There's only one opinion. And again, why does the court reach its conclusion? What rules does it use? What theories of interpretation does the opinion embrace as well? So let's get into the facts. So the effort to enact prohibition, we tend to think of it as this like failed experiment that took place only for a brief time in the early 20th century. But in reality, this effort spans almost 100 years before when the 18th Amendment got added to the Constitution, U.S. Constitution, banning alcohol sales nationwide. It started off basically going actually sort of county by county to try and ban alcohol. But eventually, once prohibition advocates got enough support within a given state, they would try to get state laws and state constitutions changed to ban booze. And so Kansas, during the 1880s, amends its state constitution to prohibit alcohol with a bit of a loophole. You could go to a doctor and get prescribed booze as a medical treatment. And the same was true when the 18th Amendment was on the books nationwide. And then the legislature passed a law to implement this new policy that was contained in the Kansas Constitution. And poor Peter Mugler, he had built a brewery. He'd spent a lot of money building the thing. It's hard to, use that kind of equipment for something other than brewing beer. And so he lost, if he wasn't able to win this case, he'd lose a lot of money, right? So he refused to comply, and he got arrested and got convicted of operating a public nuisance. So there are actually a couple of different issues in this case. But it all revolves around whether a state law banning the manufacture and sale of alcohol, both within a state and across state lines, violates either the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment or the Commerce Clause. And even within the Due Process Clause, there are two related issues. The Due Process Clause protects individuals' liberty as well as their property from infringement by state governments. The Commerce Clause issue has to do with whether a state can ban the manufacture and sale of something that is going to be intended to be sold not completely within a state but across state lines. We'll get to that a little bit later. But the Due Process Clause is something new for this course. So let's start by reading up on the language of it. No state shall deprive any person of, here it is, life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This was added to the Constitution in 1868 after the Civil War. It was part of an effort to provide equal rights to newly freed slaves. But it's actually the second due process clause that is in the Constitution. There's another due process clause in the Fifth Amendment, and that protects people from being deprived of life, liberty, or property by the federal government. If you recall, Barron versus Baltimore, to be able to have the U.S. Constitution and federal courts help people protect themselves from rights being invaded by state or local actors, you would need to rely on the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment because it says no state shall. Okay, so what exactly does due process mean? This is a kind of confusing aspect of this case because on the one hand, there's this word process, right? And that implies that government must use fair procedures before it takes away your life, liberty, or property. And in fact, I know this sounds like an oxymoron, but the term for this aspect of due process of giving people fair notice, using fair procedures so that people have an ability to respond and understand what the policy is and how they're being treated, all that kind of stuff. Those requirements are called procedural due process. So here's an example, right? Before some new federal regulation can be issued, there's a 30-day public comment period so that people who are affected or even groups can weigh in. And there's even procedures put in place such that if you hear, enough feedback, that you can actually sort of change the way the regulation ends up getting written. So you have the right to participate in the process. That's a form of procedural due process. Or another example of procedural due process is you have the right to appeal if you're convicted of a crime. So before the government can take away your life or liberty or your property through criminal punishment, you have the right to make sure that the trial was handled fairly by appealing to an appeals court. But here's the thing. We're not studying procedural due process cases in this class. All I'm really doing, all I want to do by introducing this concept is to differentiate it from what the real focus on the due process clause is in this class. It's a different concept that we call substantive due process. So this says, substantive due process says, well, you're still entitled to be treated fairly, to be given notice and ability to respond. But even if those fair procedures are followed, the deprivation of life, liberty, or property might still be unconstitutional. Why? I mean, look, let's go back here. The plain language says, no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. One way you could interpret this is to say, okay, if fair procedures have been followed, the government can do whatever it wants in terms of taking away your life, liberty, or property. But that's not what substantive due process holds. That even if they're following fair procedures, the government's attempt to deprive you of life, liberty, or property might still be unconstitutional. Why? The origin of due process of law, what it really means is in violation of the law of the land. It goes all the way back to Magna Carta, a English treaty that was made 1,000 years ago and is sort of a bulwark of Anglo-American law. And what that means is there is a broader duty for the government to conduct itself appropriately, even if fair procedures are followed. So, for instance, I know that we have the Eighth Amendment that says no cruel and unusual punishment, but let's say we didn't have the Eighth Amendment. And let's say that a state government enacted a law that said if you are littering on the street, that's a crime, and you are entitled to all the sort of notice and ability to respond. You're entitled to appeal a conviction for littering, blah blah blah. But if you are convicted and that conviction stands, you're going to get the death penalty. All right, a sort of plain meaning or strict construction understanding of due process says, well, okay, you followed fair procedures, so now the government can take away your life, right? Probably not under substantive due process. That even if you followed the fair procedures in the littering trial, the substance of that law might still be unconstitutional if it violates an individual right, right? So the notion that you could lose your life for a crime that is as minor as littering doesn't make sense. So the substance of the law, even if you follow fair procedures, might still be unconstitutional. So the question is, what individual rights are protected under a substantive due process approach? So, well, the claim that Peter Mugler's lawyers try to make is that no legislature has the right to prohibit any citizen from manufacturing for his own use or for export or storage any article of food or drink not endangering or affecting the rights of others. And so I guess the sort of extension of this argument is that, plenty of people drink responsibly. And so while it might be perfectly fair to punish people who, drink and drive, or who, uh, you know, uh, are drunk in public or whatever, plenty of people will go and purchase alcohol and consume it in a way that does not endanger the rights of others. And so no government has the right to take away that right in those sorts of circumstances. And here we get a rebuttal from Justice John Marshall Harlan, who's writing the majority opinion. And he says, look, if manufacturing beer prejudicially affects the rights and interests of the community, it follows from the very premises stated that society has the power to protect itself by legislation against the consequences of that business. Right? So, really, it's the key factor in this case is who gets to decide whether or not having the ability to purchase alcohol does or does not negatively affect the rights or interests of the community. Who should decide if this connection exists? And Harlan says it's the government. Right? Under our system of government, that power is lodged with the legislative branch. It belongs to that department to exert what are known as the police powers of the state, and to determine primarily what measures are appropriate or needful for the protection of the public morals, the public health, or the public safety. That's why we hold elections, right? That's why we let people change government policy, is because policy changes based on what the public thinks is a problem that needs to be solved. And state governments have what are called police powers. Now, don't take this too literally. Yes, state governments have police forces, but the nature of the police powers is the authority of a state government to protect public health, safety, welfare, and morality. And so, but this argument here about this is all about, letting the legislature decide based on the wishes of the voters. That's a very sort of judicial restraint kind of argument. And when it comes to sort of justifying this particular decision that the people of Kansas have made, Harlan thinks there's a pretty strong connection between alcohol and public health or public safety or public morality problems. And so he says, for we cannot shut out of view the fact that within the knowledge of all that the public health, the public morals, and the public safety may be endangered by the general use of intoxicating drinks, nor the fact established by statistics accessible to everyone that the idleness, disorder, pauperism, and crime existing in the country are, in some degrees at least, traceable to this evil. And so if you didn't know, idleness means being lazy, and pauperism means poverty, and probably homelessness too is implied by calling someone a pauper. And so here he sort of switches from judicial restraint by saying, look, all you need to do is look at the statistics. Boom, sociological jurisprudence. That's the kind of argument. He's saying that, to uphold the law would be sort of upholding public welfare because we can tell sort of objectively, based on statistics, that access to booze comes with all sorts of negative problems. Now, here's one sort of objection, that the power of state governments to promote public health, safety, welfare, and morality, it's not unlimited. The way that the state governments pursue goals of public health or public safety, public welfare, morality must be reasonable. And it seems like just a flat-out prohibition of booze doesn't seem like a particularly reasonable way to cure these problems identified on this slide, right? And furthermore, the prohibition is so extreme, the law even prohibits home brewing. And it's if it's one thing to shut down access to booze at the bar or at the corner store. But shouldn't people be able to, within the privacy of their own home, make certain decisions about how they, what they do, right? What they brew, like what they eat and drink. And here, Harlan's response is like, look, the more sort of holes, exemptions that you allow in a law, the more the law might fail. It's the same kind of thing with like exemptions for masking or social distancing during the pandemic, right? The more people you allow to get together in mass groups, and to the more legitimate reasons you offer for not masking, right? The more chances you're offering to people for the whole set of laws around preventing the spread of COVID to fail. And so, if everyone was given the right to, make small amounts of booze in their own homes, this might fail. So again, it's kind of like the argument we saw in McCulloch, except now it's not about Congress, because McCulloch was where Congress has a right to act by making a bank. It has the right to act successfully by not having a state tax it. But the same principle applies here, except to a state legislature. If the Kansas legislature has the power to act within its police powers, it has the power to be successful, right? And here is where we shift from the due process liberty issue to the Commerce Clause issue. Because part of what the law says, and part of the allegation of it not being reasonable, is that a Kansas law says you can't manufacture it for sale in Kansas, nor can you manufacture it to be sold in other states. And if something is crossing state lines, isn't that interstate commerce and within Congress's purview? But here's the thing. If Congress has regulated something using its Commerce Clause, states can't interfere. We learned that in McCulloch to a certain extent, and we certainly learned it in Gibbons versus Ogden, right, where the state monopoly had to give way to the federal law trumping. On the other hand, what we learned in those two cases was that Congress can't regulate something that is purely internal to a particular state. So Kansas definitely has the power to ban booze within its state, but it might not give Kansas the power to ban booze being exported to other states. So, but what if Congress has no regulation on booze, right? So there's this principle in the Commerce Clause, and you don't really need to know this for the exam. It might be, it's not a major focus of the case. Let me just put it that way, right? So, but the way we call the freedom of states to act economically when Congress has no policy on the issue in question is called the Dormant Commerce Clause. If Congress has not developed a policy, states have some power to regulate, not just within their own borders, but regulate how things cross into other states as well. And here's the reason why it's not a big focus of this case and will not be a major focus of the exam, and that is there was nothing about Peter Mugler's business that indicated that the beer he was making was going to be carried out of the state to be sold. And so if it's not a way in which Mugler's rights are being affected, it's not something that the court has any business in deciding. That part of the law isn't being properly raised by this case. You would have to get another defendant who does rely on out-of-state sales to come in, and because the courts can only right wrongs that have been committed against the person directly involved in the case. And Peter Mugler, he has been wronged to the extent that he can't sell beer to his fellow Kansans, but he's not been wronged because his business model doesn't, he's not planning on selling stuff out of state. Okay, so now we sort of shift back to the Due Process Clause to talk about the property aspect, that no state shall deny life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And here we get two last sort of Hail Marys from Mugler's lawyers. The first is that perhaps Kansas has the power under its police powers to ban new breweries from being established. But man, Mugler spent a lot of money. He set up a business, and so you should respect the fact when that business opened, it opened as a legal concern, and significant financial investment was made under the assumption that what was going to happen in that factory, that brewery, was legal. But Harlan's response is, yeah, but just because it was legal at the time didn't mean that the state had given any sort of assurance or had any obligation that it would always be legal. And so that's, sort of the risk of doing business, is something that is legal today might be made illegal tomorrow. And then another argument that Mugler's lawyers made was, well, you know, you there's no provision in here to provide compensation. And we saw from the facts slide at the very beginning that it's hard to repurpose that brewing equipment to do anything else other than brewing something illegal. And so there's this argument saying that, well, this case seems very similar to a Supreme Court case called Pumple versus Green Bay Company. And in that case, you had a government made a decision to flood someone's land to such an extent that it became unfit to be used. And that was held to be a deprivation of that landowner's property. That, if you are a farmer and not a fisherman, right? What you need is land to put crops on or to let your cattle graze. A lake is useless to you, right? It becomes practically unfit to be used for for farming, right? And so, if the government is responsible for turning a farm field and turning it into a lake, the government has an obligation to pay you for what that land was worth. That's the argument. That if it was true for flooding of land, it should be true by basically ruining brewing equipment. And Harlan says, yeah, not so fast. The Supreme Court, when it decided that Pumple case, that was fine. But there's three major differences between what happened in that case and what's going on with Prohibition. What happened to the farmer's land was permanent. It's hard to make a lake go away after you've created it. Whereas, the status of Kansas law, Mugler's equipment wasn't permanently destroyed, right? It's not like anyone on the police force came in and burned his brewery to the ground. That's not what happened. Also, there was when a farmer's land is gone underwater, that's a physical invasion of someone's land as a result of a state action. And again, no cops showed up to physically invade and take away or destroy his brewing equipment. And the other major difference was, if you're building a lake or a river, that can be used by the public. And so that's why you're entitled to compensation under the property aspect of the due process clause. But the prohibition law is not, taking from someone, taking something that was privately owned and making it publicly owned. It's taking something that was privately owned and producing problems, right? Alcoholism and so forth, and saying, no, you can't use your property that way to continue to cause those problems. And so, yeah, I mean, basically, Mugler has his beer manufacturing equipment. He just can't use it the way that he wants. And I think this is, kind of important to keep in mind that when it comes to you completely losing your property to the hands of the government, government's ability to do that is actually very, very limited. But the government has a wide amount of discretion to regulate how you use property. right? So, think about if you're holding a noisy party on a Saturday night, right, at a private apartment. The cops show up and tell you to turn the music down, and if you don't, you're gonna get arrested. The fact that you are using your property in too loud of a fashion um, is a use of property that the government has the right to regulate because it affects the rights of other nearby people. Now, that doesn't give the government the ability to go and seize your apartment, right, and say, "Oh, you no longer live here," right? But they can regulate the way you use your property in particular ways. So that's the distinction here. Okay, so this is basically it, right? The whole point of this case is to, one, show you the difference in the nature of power between the federal government and the states. For the federal government to be able to act, you have to find something in Article 1, Section 8 that says Congress shall have the power to do X, Y, or Z. For a state government to act, all it needs to be able to say is this law is a reasonable way to promote some aspect of public health, public safety, public welfare, or public morality. And we call that kind of those four powers, health, safety, welfare, and morality, the police powers. Um, so the law stands, and prohibition spreads all over the place. And what happens to poor Peter Mugler? Well, as you can tell, he moved to California and he set up a new brewery there. So I guess all's well that ends well. I found this on eBay. The picture, I didn't actually buy the thing, but I guess there are people out there that are obsessed with collecting like old beer bottles and stuff like that. So that's cool, I suppose. Um, so yeah, it's good to know that Peter Mugler, didn't have to become an accountant or something boring like that. He was still able to become a brewer, right? He just had to move somewhere else. Okay, so uh, what might be fair questions to ask, short answer questions to ask on the next quiz? So, why, for example, why does Mugler think that there's a constitutional right to drink beer? Right, this really does sort of set up the debate over the due process liberty in this case, which is, the or at least the alleged due process liberty. That's to have when when something isn't injuring someone, the rights of others, uh, the the state government doesn't have the right to take that away, right? And the reason why Mugler isn't revered as a national hero, right, is because of John Marshall Harlan's response, which is, look, like, actually kind of does cause problems drinking, and really the ultimate decider about um, what things cause problems and what don't is the legislature, not the judges. Um, and then finally, I think it's would be fair game to ask, like, well, shouldn't Mugler's be entitled to compensation from the government because he spent all this money on equipment that now he can't use, not only for beer, but he really can't use for anything else either. And so, why does Justice Harlan refuse to classify this law as a deprivation of property? Well, it's because that's what happens when things are deemed, when government policy changes, is that laws create winners and losers when it comes to the economy all the time. And the government doesn't have to open up its checkbook every time something that had been legal gets made illegal. So that's it. I hope this helps you understand the case a little bit better. If not, feel free to ask a whole bunch of questions, and I will see you next time. Thanks.